Salvador Alvarenga awoke at sunrise, rolled out of his hammock clad only in surfer shorts and walked 4 steps to where the jungle turned into lagoon. The loudest noises were street dogs barking in the distance and birds singing atop palm trees shredded by stormy winds. Barefoot, his shoulder decorated by a death's head tattoo, Alvarenga carved fresh imprints in the sand as he strolled to inspect his 25-foot fishing boat in the pre-dawn glow. Alvarenga was planning to leave early, so he needed to run an inventory on his boat. Thieves had been pilfering gear, unclipping one boat's propeller, stealing spark plugs from another, and on occasion filching an entire motor. Heisting a motor took 2 men, and at night, in the sand, it was an unwieldy operation, so usually the robberies were quick hit-and-run operations. Alvarenga's boss had bought a watchdog that they tied to a stake and was supposed to keep an eye on mischief. Within a month, the dog was dead. One night I heard a commotion outside, by the edge of the lagoon, and I came out and saw this animal tossing the dog. Then there was a whole lot of screaming. The dog went flying, said Alvarenga. A crocodile had the dog in its mouth and was dragging it across the lagoon. There was no way to save the dog. It would be crazy to jump in the water to fight a 9-foot croc. After the incident, Willie didn't buy any more watchdogs and Alvarenga stopped taking long swims across the lagoon. As he inspected his boat, Alvarenga noticed the anchor and chain were missing, but it was a colleague, not a thief, who had snatched the gear to use in a shallow sea coastal fishing gig. Alvarenga didn't mind the lack of an anchor. The extra deck space allowed him to better pack spare fuel, drinking water, and a sedan-sized pile of buoys that would float his line across the ocean's surface when he began to fish later that day. Besides, he was headed on a deep-sea mission where the ocean was hundreds of feet deep, and anchor was useless. Alvarenga loved the simple lines of the fiberglass craft. No cabin or roof. Just a long narrow canoe-shaped boat that many people in Mexico called a banana boat. It was designed to carve up the waves like a huge surfboard, making it agile, fast and easy to roll. Atop the deck, a fiberglass crate the size of a refrigerator lay mouth skyward, the lid in the sand. Though empty, the box reeked of rotten fish. This crate was the measure of Alvarenga's finances. If he could fill the icebox with fresh fish, 1,500 pounds, he had enough money to survive for a full week. But Alvarenga was never a man interested in just surviving. He enjoyed life to its fullest, inviting friends to seafood buffets, drinking Corona beer until sunrise, dating 3 women at a time, and picking up the tab for his colleagues after all-night parties in local restaurants. If the fish weren't biting or the storm was too wild, he went hiking and hunting. With either a borrowed rifle or his trusty slingshot, Alvarenga disappeared for days as he stalked animals in the wooded mountains just inland from the mangrove jungles that guarded the coast. In the mountains, hunting and camping with a friend or two, Alvarenga found his cherished respite and distance from society, as well as an abundant supply of meat. Raccoon, opossum, coati, iguana and migrating birds were all fair game in his battle to satiate a raging capacity to ingest food. Alvarenga owned no refrigerator or pantry. It was literally slingshot to mouth as he shot his prey then ate it. Alvarenga had few living expenses. The fishing cooperative, the Shrimpers of the Coast, paid his housing and utilities. Instead of health insurance, he knew that if he was injured, his colleagues would patch him up, and if his wounds were life-threatening, they would rush him to the nearest hospital. Local doctors were experienced in the art of reattaching a severed finger or patching chunks of flesh ripped away by fishhooks. Accidents at sea were common, but as long as the crew was able to stay near the boat, they could usually survive. However, if the boat sank, it was often the sharks that ended the story. Alvarenga's boat, at 25 feet, was as long as 2 pickup trucks and as wide as one. With no raised structure, no glass and no running lights, it was virtually invisible at sea. With a draft of less than 2 feet and the engine mounted on the back, when the motor was full out, the bow in the front third of the boat tilted out of the water and could shoot through the waves or maneuver the tight waterways of the mangrove forest. Police often stopped these boats on the open ocean under suspicion that they were running north with drugs or immigrants, traditions as old and storied as fishing along this outlaw coast. The police would tell the crew to lift up their shirts, then feel up the fishermen's bellies, checking that the men had not swallowed plastic-wrapped balls of cocaine. Usually the fishermen submitted to the surprise police or Navy inspections, even slicing open their fresh fish to prove that they were not stuffed with cocaine. But if they were smugglers, they rocketed through the shallows where they nearly always escaped, in the worst case, running the boat directly into the thick mangrove branches, abandoning ship and seeking refuge in the dense jungle. Cargo, be it cocaine, pot or immigrants, was left behind. In the mangrove forest, lethal and aggressive fer-de-lance and jumping viper snakes awaited. These snakes are well camouflaged, their skin mimicking the speckled brown of splotchy leaves on the forest floor. The vipers are aggressive and quick to strike if a predator approaches. Bites can be fatal, yet it is a risk the contrabandist is willingly assumed, knowing that the police rarely followed anyone into the mangroves. The authorities often remained on the water, resigned to seizing the suspect boat and towing it back to the naval base, where it was held for ransom, like a car towed for illegal parking. Alvarenga partied hard and loved the challenging day-and-a-half or 3-day fishing shifts. He was an accomplished fisherman who routinely brought home 500 pounds more product than the other boats. On days like this, when the fish were biting, Alvarenga was sure he could repeat the bonanza of the previous day's haul. He was determined to set out early. He had spent hardly any money the night before and still had nearly 150 United States dollars. But there was never enough cash. On a good night of partying, he could spend all that and more on beer for his friends, food for his date and tequila for all. Alvarenga planned to leave at 10 a.m. and work straight through until 4 p.m. the next day. In preparation for a 30-hour shift including a night at sea, Alvarenga packed into a gray 5-gallon bucket a carefully wrapped small mirror, a razor, his toothbrush and 2 changes of clothes. Even at sea, as he chopped the heads off the tuna or was slathered in thick shark blood, Alvarenga shaved daily. He brushed his teeth at all hours of the day and checked the mirror to make sure he maintained a modicum of civilized existence. His job allowed him the kind of lifestyle where he could simply dump his dirty work clothes into the corner and wear them again and again, never washing the clothes. When they were fouled or blood-stained, he tossed them in the trash, purchased another cheap pair of shorts and a t-shirt and restarted the month-long cycle. But when it was time to hit the town, Alvarenga spiked his hair, splashed on cologne, shined his shoes and shaved. Alvarenga and his mate packed their boat with the cadence and confidence of men on autopilot. Among the coastal fishermen, the respective roles of captain and mate are marked with a military-style discipline and respect for rank. Captain Alvarenga, anchored at the stern, would run the motor and steer while Ray Perez, his skinny 20-something mate, dashed about the boat fixing gear, setting lines and organizing equipment. On land, Ray was a wild outlaw who raised havoc with colleagues and the law. But at sea he was a loyal companion and a tireless worker, and the 2 men filled the shifts with raucous laughter. Loading the boat was a 2-hour process and involved over 1,000 pounds of equipment, including 70 gallons of gasoline, 16 gallons of water, 100 pounds of sardines for bait, 700 hooks, miles of line, a harpoon, 3 knives, 3 bailing buckets, a cell phone in a plastic bag to avoid seawater, a GPS tracking device not waterproof, a 2-way radio, battery half-charged, several wrenches for the motor and 200 pounds of ice. Draped over the entire pile of gear was a mountain of empty bleach and detergent bottles, the blue, white and pink containers adding a carnivalesque touch of colors to the scene. The heaviest items were the gasoline containers, which sank the boat to just 20 inches above the waterline. The forward bench was smeared a lighter shade of white, evidence of recent epoxy and reinforcement work to seal a cracked strut. The largest item on the boat was a 5-foot-long and 4-foot-high icebox with a removable lid. When filled with ice and fish, the box was so heavy it had the potential to flip the craft if it shifted at sea. Securing the icebox to keep its bulk centered was a basic safety requirement. Alvarenga used the biggest icebox available. Its size was both a macho bragging right and a testament to his unceasing ability to fill it with fish. Along the shore, a convoy of 10 boats prepared to embark at roughly the same time. Like trucks at a loading dock, the boats were lined up side by side in a flurry of last-minute activity. As they pushed off, Alvarenga shifted the motor into reverse and pulled away from shore. He turned the boat around and began motoring toward a rough surf break where the estuary waters met the open Pacific. Exiting the lagoon was a tricky navigation among sandbars and crashing waves. Several fishermen had been killed at the break, and 6 months earlier Alvarenga had been in a boat, but not at the helm, when it rolled down the face of a wave, turned over and nearly crushed him in a tumult of rolling boat, flying equipment and thundering water. The flotilla of fishing boats continued 5 minutes into the open ocean, then the engines were cut to idle. The boats gathered and aligned side by side. Like covered wagons crossing a desert, these travelers had a ritual of joining for one last powwow before each faced destiny on his own. For the fishermen, this was a combination of a town hall community update and gossip around the office water cooler. Given their love of marijuana and absence of any official oversight, the men smoked one cigar-sized joint after another. No one could remember how the last toke tradition started, but it was now a fixture, most likely a legacy of the 50-year tradition of Mexican fishermen smuggling loads of marijuana north up the coast to the lucrative U.S. market. The men shouted out jokes and insults rained down. Laughter bounced from boat to boat. After the smoke, Alvarenga headed west and, navigating in the open ocean, followed his handheld GPS to the spot where he and Ray had caught so many fish the previous day. It took them 6 hours to get there. They were now in the middle of the Gulf of Tehuantepec, and they spent another 2 hours baiting the hooks, laying out the line and settling in. By 7 p.m., they had the entire 2-mile line stretched out behind them. The stars were bright, a strong but pleasant breeze whipped out of the northeast, and Alvarenga smoked several more joints with Ray. They laughed and shared stories of conquest, failure and recent engine troubles. 4 days earlier their motor had died and they had been hauled to shore by a nearby colleague who was fortuitously close when he heard Alvarenga's SOS calls on Channel 2, the bandwidth used by fishermen in the Gulf of Tehuantepec. Neither man was afraid of the scenario, colleagues were always nearby. "We survived lots of storms together," says Ray. "When the waves would slam us from one side to another he would say, 'Go to sleep. Get a blanket.' I would ask, 'What about the waves?' And he would say, 'Take a nap.'" Quote. Anxious to check if they had any catch, at 10 p.m., the duo motored down the line. They quickly confirmed another huge haul. A hammerhead shark was thrashing just below the surface, trying to rip out a hook set deep in the mouth. They waited until 2 a.m., and Ray began to bring in the line. He hauled the hammerhead to the side of the boat, where Alvarenga used a gaffing hook to prevent it from escaping. Ray then bashed it on the top of the head with a handcrafted wooden club. Whether it was shark or tuna, the men always tried to kill the fish while it was still in the water. Other fishermen used a homemade taser, a crude system rigged from a car battery and 2 long wires with clips that could be inserted into the flesh of the fish to deliver an instant and deadly electric shock. Like a slaughterhouse for cows or chickens, this killing of the fish was the brutal back office that consumers never saw or even imagined when they filled a shopping cart with canned tuna or ordered a fresh mahi-mahi steak at a restaurant. For Alvarenga and Ray, it was crucial to kill all the fish before hauling them aboard. A snapping shark might sever a pair of toes or remove a chunk from the lower leg. Sailfish and marlin, with their spear of a bill, were particularly feared. For 2 hours Ray pulled in the line. It was an exhausting chore that required extremely strong shoulder and forearm muscles. Again, it was another sumptuous payday. Mahi-mahi, hammerhead shark, thresher shark and a sailfish filled the icebox, 1,200 pounds they guessed. In a single cast of their line the icebox was nearly topped off, so there was no point tossing it out again. They would zip to shore in 5 hours, shower, change clothes, eat, restock the boat and head out for a second and final round. Their 30-hour shift would now be 60 hours of nearly non-stop work. If all went well they would nail a third consecutive big catch, an uncommon streak of luck. As they motored back, the men were half awake, having managed only sporadic bouts of sleep over the past several days. They wanted to smoke marijuana but there was none left. Onshore, that too could quickly be restocked. Enthused and giddy, they decided to tell their boss not to pay them. Like poker players they wanted to build a stash, gamble they could win the next round and then collect all their winnings. $300 apiece was a guarantee they could finance a 2-day party with piles of marijuana, bottles of tequila and cases of beer. Neither man had any doubts that he could instantly spend all the money. Of all the pleasures, Alvarenga most loved gourmet meals, especially shrimp dishes on plates the size of a hubcap. He could eat the entire banquet alone or with friends. He often treated colleagues to a free meal and always maintained a substantial positive balance in the local favor bank. As they arrived at shore Ray made a surprise announcement. He needed to sign probation papers at the local prison. He was out on bail for armed robbery and had itchy fingers. Ray stole so often that trouble was never far away. He kept a pistol stashed in the small of his back and, as he made sure everyone knew, kept a .22 caliber bullet in the chamber. Ray tried to spin the delay in a positive way by reminding Alvarenga, who had never been imprisoned, that every visit to prison meant he received back a percentage of his bail money. "We will have more money to party," Ray told Alvarenga as they hurriedly packed the boat in preparation for the next trip. "I told him to wait for me," says Ray. "I packed the boat, the ice, the bait, everything and rushed to court. We knew exactly where the fish were biting, it was a perfect moment." With Ray temporarily out of action, Alvarenga became impatient. He wondered if his regular mate would even make it back by midday, so he started searching for a temporary worker. Alvarenga made the rounds of day laborers, a roaming band of men who walked the lagoon waterfront with a bag of food, a sack of clothes, perhaps a favorite knife and a keen desire to grab a day's work in exchange for a $50 cash payday upon return to shore. Alvarenga found a young man eager to work. His friend Wolfman was always training apprentice fishermen and could be counted on to raise an extra crew member on a moment's notice. Wolfman arranged for Alvarenga to head out with Ezekiel Cordoba, a 22-year-old with the nickname Piñata who lived at the far end of the lagoon, where he was best known as a star on the village soccer team. Alvarenga and Cordoba had seen each other occasionally on the soccer field but had never spoken, much less worked together. Alvarenga suspected that as a crewmate he was far from ideal. Cordoba was accustomed to the calm waters of the lagoon and had less than 2 years' experience deep at sea. Alvarenga knew the risks of heading out with a rookie. Many a landlubber friend had pleaded to go fishing, and then spent the bulk of the trip vomiting and begging for solid ground. But time was tight, so Alvarenga, after first dismissing the young man, finally relented in the face of Cordoba's pleas and told him to wait at the docks while he went to eat. Under a tin-roofed structure with no walls or windows, a long blue wooden table served as breakfast table and de facto community pub and gossip hall for the fishermen. Breakfast was no tea and crackers snack but heaps of eggs, refried beans, potatoes and onions all slathered with cheese and green jalapeno sauce. Alvarenga drank his morning coffee and listened to the talk of a brewing storm. The warnings of a dangerous northern storm system descending on the Gulf of Tehuantepec did little to thin the ranks. Like Alvarenga, most of the fishermen were listening to even stronger countervailing arguments. Schools of tuna, sharks in hunting packs and the always thriving Mexico City fish market, where every day, beginning at 2:30 a.m., millions of dollars worth of sea creatures were bought, sold and shipped. I am going with this new guy, but I will be back in time for the party, Alvarenga told his supervisor Mino at the beachside breakfast. Alvarenga was reminded that he was in charge of bringing food to a party the following evening. He must not forget. It was his job to purchase 15 chickens for a birthday party in honor of Doña Mina, a local chef who served as den mother to many of the fishermen. There's a storm coming, Willie, the owner of the boats, warned his employees, though experience taught him that, short of a hurricane or crushing hangover, there was little that would keep Alvarenga and many of the others from embarking. Alvarenga was more worried he might head to sea without his customary stash of lemons and salt to make ceviche. I always brought extra supplies in case we had to stay out an extra day, got a bit lost or blown off course by a storm. You have to go to sea prepared. I was accustomed to staying out longer than the others. When they didn't get a good catch, they would come back in. Not me. I would stay out and try again, set the line at another location. I was a good fisherman. Shark fishermen at sea have few cooking options. There is no oven, no stove, and lighting a fire aboard carries obvious risks. Alvarenga prepared for the overnight trip by arranging for a local cook to prepare cow livers. He brought enough of the roasted meat to stuff a couple pounds of tortillas. Aboard the boat and out at sea, he used a bench as a cutting board to chop cilantro, onions and tomatoes. Tomatoes were cherished at sea, though they tended to get mashed long before mealtime. For a feast he needed only fresh tuna, a sharp knife and a splash of salt water. As he left for sea, he figured the storm might slow down the fishing and cause him to stay for 2 days instead of one, so he grabbed a handful of extra lemons. He also paid 200 pesos $17 for 2 fist-sized wads of marijuana buds wrapped in newspaper. It was a ritual for every trip. At sea, especially at night as he waited for the sharks, tuna and mahi-mahi to attack his lines, he smoked one thick joint after another as he enjoyed the stars. United in their defiance of weather reports, the 10 fishing boats motored straight into the tangle of waves where the Costa Azul estuary is slammed by incoming breakers from the Pacific Ocean. Under full power, the fishermen hunkered down as they timed the wave sets. White foam blew off the waves and floated like snow. The key was to accelerate swiftly in the brief calm between breakers. Soaked from the splashing waves and half-blind from salt in his eyes, Salvador Alvarenga steered with his left hand and held tight to a thick pole with his right to keep from bouncing out of the boat. In a day, perhaps 2, he would be heading back to shore, another stash of fish in the cooler. Then he planned to collect his wages for the last several days. I liked money, said Alvarenga. But no one could say I was a crook, and if they saw me drunk with a woman they at least knew what it had cost me to get that money. I held my head high wherever I was. Alvarenga wore a black balaclava-style mask with holes cut out for his eyes and nose. La terrorista, the other fisherman joked, but the scorching sun grilled his white skin. Alvarenga didn't have their copper-colored skin or genetic protection against the harsh sun. The Alvarengas had originally come from the mountains of Spain. They held up well in snow and cold, but not in this tropical heat, which in less than 3 hours could turn a man's skin to swollen bubbles of burned flesh. Alvarenga scanned the waves and set his course at 280 degrees west-northwest. The radio in his bucket was beeping, but Alvarenga never noticed because it was buried with his clothes. Many fishermen used the radio non-stop, like truck drivers chatting on the CB, but for Alvarenga life at sea meant going off the grid. He often spent 2 days at sea without a single call to shore. Alvarenga sought a total escape from the static and confusion of day-to-day life onshore. As he blasted through the waves and the mountains of the coast began to hunch toward the horizon, Alvarenga was relaxed. He did not realize he was traveling west at roughly the same pace at which a huge norteño was stealthily forming and advancing from the northeast. The storm was still behind the coastal mountains, it had yet to show its face. Had he stopped for lunch, he would have noticed that while the sky above was blue, from the northeast skid marks of thin gray clouds pushed forward, unassuming advance scouts for a storm not yet rattling the warning system by which veteran fishermen track changes in weather hours before those on land notice even a whiff of danger. The storm, which shadowed Alvarenga, was now showing up on meteorologists' maps as cold front number 11. It was gaining strength on land but had yet to reach the men far offshore. Alvarenga knew the danger of storms better than most, but he was on a streak. He had just caught half a ton of fish and there were plenty more to be taken. He expected storms this time of year. November was always rowdy. The key, he explained to Cordoba, was to read the wind, waves and clouds. A glimpse at the waves and sky was information enough for him to calculate the punch of any storm. Today's gusts had teeth. He could feel the power as the cloud bank built over the mountaintops to the east. But Alvarenga accepted the challenge and refused to change his plans. Had he traveled with access to either the internet or meteorological reports, they would have changed drastically. Lacking any clear warnings, the two men took positions, Alvarenga at the helm and Cordoba prone, like a figurehead stretched out on the bow, scanning for debris that could destroy or flip their boat. Floating coconuts, practically invisible during choppy seas, made a horrific clack when they smacked the hull. Tree trunks were capable of catching the propeller and catapulting the boat end over end. Abandoned fishing nets could foul the motor. A submerged sea turtle could destroy the propeller. Their journey out to the fishing grounds in the Gulf of Tehuantepec required 5 hours of constant vigilance, and barely an hour into the trip Cordoba felt seasick and homesick. He had signed on for a day job, not a torture session. His stomach was in his throat, his tongue frantic as it searched for stability. Cordoba's eyes rolled with the waves. Vomiting only lasted as long as his stomach had something to offer. Then Cordoba began dry heaves, a convulsion that, lacking any lubricant, made his throat feel like it was afire. The new guys always vomit and grab the rail. They get dizzy and are not sure what to do. There's nothing they can do, said Lavaca, a fellow fisherman. I told Ezekiel not to go so far out that day, the storm was tough. I didn't go out. 2 decades aboard small boats had taught Alvarenga to internalize the sequence and predictability of wave patterns. To be a good fisherman, you have to get your mind in order, to know how to attack the sea, how to catch the fish. I could look for a certain color of green and know that we would find fish. The movements of the birds also help. You can see them eating fish. A novice would not last 5 minutes without flipping the boat in the choppy 8-foot waves. Alvarenga hardly noticed. Like a practiced surfer, he simultaneously spotted and translated the subtle messages embedded in each wave. With constant adjustments to the throttle and steering, he threaded a path. When a wave ambushed them, Cordoba was knocked off his feet and smashed hard to the floor. He scurried back into position, but Alvarenga noted that his novice deckhand would need constant scrutiny. Sitting in the stern, Alvarenga had more stability. They were running a course nearly parallel to the waves, making them susceptible to being sideswiped from the right and rolled. When a wave forced the boat sideways, Alvarenga would gun the engine hard, cut the boat into a tight 360-degree spin and again set up his attack angle. There were no other boats on the horizon, not that Alvarenga could see more than half a mile. There was no rain, but the chop and spray glazed his eyes. The ocean was bouncing around. I told Cordoba to hang on, said Alvarenga. We were going over the waves. They were not so big, but still we were bouncing out of the water, slamming down. Alvarenga knew a feared norteño was building. It was obvious, you could smell it. I could feel it in my body, but I had experienced this many times before. These coastal storms were characterized by violent gusts of wind but little rain and could last for days, said Alvarenga, who recalled a ripping wind but no rain and scattered high clouds. The day was nice and sunny, he said. It was hot. As the men roiled farther out to sea, the wind increased from 20 miles per hour to a sustained 30 miles per hour, still well under the 72 miles per hour mark for a Category I hurricane, but enough to fill the young Cordoba with fear. It's a wind that whistles, explained Alvarenga. The waves come this way, that way. And the waves are breaking in all directions. Each one is 2 meters, 6 to 7 feet, high and smashing into each other. As the wind ratcheted up, the conversation ceased. Cordoba clung to the bow, gripping the rail. At 5 p.m., the two men arrived at the designated fishing grounds and extended their 2-mile line while baiting 700 hooks evenly spaced along the length of the contraption. To keep the line afloat, every 20 yards an empty plastic bleach bottle was tied to the line. Snaking behind the boat on the ocean's surface, it looked like a line of trash. After we threw out our lines we talked more, said Alvarenga. By 8 p.m., the line was fully extended and floating out behind them, creating a powerful drag that provided stability from waves seeking to push and pull them in all directions. The men had nothing to do but wait for fish to attack the bait. Cordoba fell asleep. Alvarenga smoked marijuana and kept an eye on the line. Container ships from the nearby port of Salina Cruz were known to slice through and cut the lines. Even waving strobe lights in their path was no guarantee that the drone-like ships would change course. Many were on autopilot and the tiny fishing boat captains did their best to scurry away at the first sign of an approaching container ship. Around 1 a.m., Alvarenga felt a deep warning. The voice of the storm picked up and Alvarenga took note. The swells gathered strength and the boat began to tilt sideways like a ride at an amusement park. Cordoba was terrified and losing control. Get us out of here. Let's go back, he screamed at Alvarenga. We are going to die. Shut up, Alvarenga ordered. But as the winds and waves jacked up, the boat began to fill with water. Alvarenga told Cordoba to start bailing. Using a bleach bottle with the top sliced off, he began furiously dumping seawater back into the ocean. Despite Cordoba's frantic bailing, the crashing waves filled their boat with water faster than they could empty it. Alvarenga now joined the bailing effort. We've got to bring the lines in now. This norteño, it's a complicated one, Alvarenga yelled to the young mate. Cordoba didn't react. Dumbass. Move it. Alvarenga shouted. Let's crank up the motor. Start pulling in the line. Under normal conditions, the captain would watch as the deckhand labored for hours to haul in the line, but the storm winds were whistling, so Alvarenga donned thick gloves and, wary of the hooks, began to assist Cordoba as they hauled in the line, yard by yard. Waves were dumping 2 inches of water into the boat at a time, so while Cordoba pulled, Alvarenga bailed. Working together, Alvarenga and Cordoba managed to recover half the line. They were exhausted but jubilant, as they had landed a fantastic catch, 10 fish including tuna, mahi-mahi and sharks. Blood from the recently killed fish splattered the boat, then washed to the floor in a sloshing crimson pool. The dangers of getting hooked, bit or gaffed were constant. Even the shark's skin was dangerous, like a file it could flay an uncovered thigh or arm. It shaves off your skin, peels it right off in slices. With all that salt water it hurts. Basically it shreds you, said Alvarenga. It is like a road rash from a motorcycle crash. Alvarenga guided the motorboat and continued to haul in the fishing line as saltwater spray skewed his vision. His 25-foot boat kept getting yanked and dragged so violently it was impossible to stand up without holding tight to the rail. With jugs of extra gasoline and the wooden box to store the net taking up most of the floor space, there was little room for Alvarenga to move. Then Alvarenga made a radical decision. They didn't have enough time to haul in the entire line, instead he would cut it off. He knew it was thousands of dollars worth of line and hooks that would float away, with hundreds of dollars worth of catch still hooked, but the storm was turning ugly. Alvarenga took out his fishing knife and sliced the blue cord. They were free. But without the stabilizing drag provided by the long fishing line, they began to bounce as if being shaken by a giant. Cordoba was crying as Alvarenga shined a light on his compass, set a course of 70 degrees east into the gale and in the dark of night aimed for home. If all went well, Alvarenga figured, he would be eating chicken and drinking beer before sunset and then enjoy a week-long fiesta while he waited out the storm.